All right, folks, we're just going to give people another couple of minutes to make the virtual commute in. While we wait, Phi Club is a great networking opportunity. So please use the chat to introduce yourself. You can also let us know if your organization is hiring or has an event coming up, anything in particular that you want to ask or have folks know. And I will find my deck to share again. Oops, hang on one sec. Okay, good morning. We'll go ahead and get started as it's 9:04 or so, and we're hoping to have you off of here around 10. Welcome. This is the Philanthropy Club of Illinois, our November meeting around the question to AI or not to AI. That is the question. First, a couple of notes about Philanthropy Club or Phi Club. Philanthropy Club of Illinois was founded over 20 years ago by Gus Wilhelmy, the co-founder of the Safer Foundation. The club is 100% volunteer driven, and our singular goal is to level the playing field for all Illinois nonprofits when it comes to access to funding to support the mission of their organizations and the communities that they serve. We fulfill this goal by providing no-cost monthly programming to support nonprofits with access to funders and by offering technical skill building for effective fundraising. Phi Club is sponsored by Forefront. We're very grateful to Forefront. Today we have Susie and Emily on the call helping with the tech side. You may not see them, but they are working in the background and they will be responsible for sending out a follow-up email to everyone who's registered. You should find a link to Forefront's website in the chat, but it's myforefront.org. Susie and Emily may share some other Forefront events coming up, which you should take a look at. Our Forefront staff partner is Susie Lee, currently behind the scenes, ensuring that we have a seamless time of learning this morning. And we thank Susie so much for all that she does. If someone forwarded you the invite to this session and you'd like to make sure you receive Phi Club program notifications directly, I'll put Susie's email in the chat in a moment, and you can send her a note so she can add you to the list. Today, as I said earlier, but for those just coming on, Phi Club is a great place to network and to meet other folks. Please use the chat this morning, especially now, to introduce yourself and your organization. Tell us what your organization does. This is also a great space to share upcoming events, and if you are hiring, a great place to get the word out. What we're going to do today, our plan is to have our two panelists speak just for maybe 30 minutes or so, and then to turn it over to questions. So at the end of the program, I'll invite you to take yourself off of mute. But for now, please use the chat to answer any questions. I'll try to keep an eye on it as I'm moderating the discussion and bring up any relevant points at the time that they're mentioned. If you want to ask a question anonymously, I would invite you to send that directly to me. I'll try to keep track of those as well. Could be anonymous for any kind of reason. I won't question that at all. All right, in just a moment, I will introduce our panelists. First, we have, familiar to many of you, Carlos Garcia Leon. Carlos is a queer, non-binary, Latina, and Mexican statesian. They were born in Puebla, Mexico, and reside on the stolen land of the Peoria, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, and Garcia tribes, which we all know as Chicago. Their work is driven by a fight for cultural equity, decolonizing the arts, and social justice. As such, Carlos describes themselves as anti-capitalist, community-centric, theoretical fundraiser. Carlos has spoken at multiple conferences, introducing the work of community-centric fundraising and building a more gender-inclusive workplace to hundreds of attendees. They hold a BM in bassoon performance from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MA in Arts Administration, along with an MBA from the University of Cincinnati. Outside of working, Carlos is a poet, writer, and fledgling kickboxer. They enjoy their leisure time by hanging out with friends, resisting capitalism by taking naps, dancing to Latin, disco, and house music, and exploring new Chicago food spots. Our second panelist, Adrianne Yu, is a second-generation Chinese-Canadian immigrant and settler in Toronto on Treaty 13 territory. She is a leadership coach and a change consultant who believes in a version of leadership that heals, liberates, and disrupts. Prior to launching her own practice in 2022, Adrianne spent over a decade driving systemic change across sectors, including curating award-winning inclusive leadership programming, leading people-centered digital transformations, and developing equitable and resilient teams in tech. She now partners with radicalized women and non-binary folks to lead with more intention and less self-doubt. A community builder at heart, Adrianne is co-creator of Dragon Center Stories, a storytelling project honoring the untold histories of immigrant communities. She believes in the power of collective care and volunteers with Empower 'em, Climbers for Palestine, and Pen to Paper. She's also a regional co-chair for the Governor General's Canadian Leadership Conference and is a 2022 alum of that program. I'm going to stop my share just so we can all see each other a little bit better. And before I invite Adrianne and Carlos to tell us about their position on using artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence in fundraising, I'm just going to introduce this topic a little bit and set some parameters for what we're going to talk about. This conversation came out of a conversation that Carlos and I were having privately. We were trying to figure out our topic for November. We were coming up with ideas, and I said, I'll just throw this into ChatGPT. And then Carlos took that opportunity to educate me and to tell me a little bit about their position on the use of generative artificial intelligence. So that is to say, I'm an occasional AI user. I think I've used it differently and more consciously since I spoke with Carlos. And that is the idea of this conversation here today. We respect and we know that some people will continue to use generative AI, but we just want to offer some insights into the very real costs of using it, which include environmental, social, and personal risks. All things that are kind of not a part of our discussion right now with everybody racing to adapt. I also just want to say there are lots of arguments, some of them really interesting, about the fact that like we're using AI already when you use autocorrect in your texting or when you use spell check on a computer. And that's less of what we're talking about today. Today, we're really going to focus on ChatGPT, Boodlebox, Cloud, all of the generative AI machines now, the large language models that can generate or edit large blocks of text. So that's more specifically where we're focusing. All right, with that kind of parameter being set for our discussion, I want to invite Carlos and Adrianne first to just tell us your position on generative AI, how you arrived at this position, what experiences or observations led you to it, and what perspectives you are bringing to this conversation. And Adrianne, I would like to start with you as our international guest.
International, thank you. North of the border, yes. Thank you for having me. It's really nice to see everybody. So in terms of my position on Gen AI, so I don't use ChatGPT and I also don't use similar Gen AI tools, but I also don't believe in shaming people who use it because I really don't think the conversation is as binary as whether you use it or you don't use it. I think for me as a leadership coach who approaches my work from an anti-oppressive as well as a trauma-informed lens, it's really important to recognize the agency that we have as individuals to make choices. So choices on a daily basis, choices in different situations that serve us as well as our community. And I think this is where our individual power comes from. So when ChatGPT was launched in 2022 of November, I was actually working with a tech client and I was embedded in their team, very close to the team that was building their own sort of internal ChatGPT tool. And so I had a lot of proximity in terms of seeing the team that was building it, the approaches they were using to build it, the lack of diversity that was in those teams that were building it as well. And then very quickly, I saw the rise of ChatGPT. And what I noticed was that a lot of people were adopting this deeply capitalist tool because of this narrative that was really dominant, which is there is this fear of being left behind or becoming obsolete or becoming irrelevant if you don't jump on this bandwagon and immediately train yourself on this new skill. And I think what was happening with those scarcity narratives, and it was really dominant in the tech organization I was working with, was that it's actually stopping a lot of people from questioning what are the actual costs of just jumping on board and over relying on these technologies that are actually built for profit, extraction, as well as domination. And there's a lot of money, like an outrageous amount of money, being pumped into these technologies to accelerate the scale of it by billionaires like the Elon Musk, right? Like the Jeff Bezos, like the Zuckerbergs, and then now the Sam Altmans, who is the CEO of OpenAI, which is behind ChatGPT. And so the questions or the things that sort of bubble up to the surface for me, and the things that I hope to bring to today's conversation is to talk about how are we relinquishing our agency when we use tools like ChatGPT. For example, when we go and use these tools to brainstorm new ideas, what is that actually doing to our capacity to imagine and create? When we use ChatGPT to polish our message or emails before sending it out, or maybe we're using it to kind of polish a tough conversation or how we're going to respond to somebody. What does that do to our ability to connect and see each other as human beings in the moment? When we use ChatGPT to seek maybe answers when we're feeling anxious or uncertain about an outcome or situation, what does that do to our ability to understand ourselves more deeply, as well as access the wisdom that we all already have internally? And so I hope that, at the end of the day, people are making informed decisions before jumping into these tools, because some of those dominant narratives is like, you got to get on board, like, or else you're going to fall behind. And I think it's also understanding the real cost, especially the internal cost to convenience as well as productivity.
Thanks for that. Thanks so much for that, Adrianne. I'll follow up later. I want to hear more about your experience, especially in the corporate and the not nonprofit sector. For now, I would like to welcome Carlos to answer the same question. Tell us about your position on AI, how you arrived there, and what perspectives you bring to this conversation.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. I wanted to briefly joke that I feel like we're representing all of America. Like if I was still in Mexico, we would have Mexico, Canada, and US.
Hey, there you go.
Incredible. Hi, everyone. I don't like it, is my general position. And my intro to it was my former boss at I really enjoyed using it from time to time, and I just thought, oh, maybe I should also try it. Um, and I tried to log in and ChatGPT. Sent it to my work email, and my work email just never got that email for to log in. So that I took it as a sign that the universe does not need me to be using ChatGPT. But outside of that, it there was a lot of moments where I reminded myself that part of the reason I come from an arts background, where I'm pursuing performance, used to performer. A lot of the things I like about fundraising are the creative aspects, like thinking about writing or how to come up with a pipeline plan. Under a lot of the moments that I enjoy are creative moments in fundraising, even though I know oftentimes we think about our field as very data centered. And I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying that there's often moments where I do value the creative aspect of what we do. And it felt to me at the time, and I still feel this now, that using any sort of generative AI would take away the thing that I enjoyed the most about fundraising, right? I really enjoy writing. And if I put it to a generative AI, I'm no longer doing the thing that I enjoy the most. Um, and eventually, and we'll talk about it more, we started finding out, the harms of it. I saw that there were environmental impacts that were not great, or more studies came out. Again, and we'll talk more studies came out about how, as Adrianne mentioned, the thinking portion of people who use it, right, are no longer happening. Literacy is going down. Critical thinking is going down because of it. And eventually, for me, coming from and working in an arts institution, it felt really awful to imagine that the work that we can put on stage or on galleries um, could be just taken away by from skilled artists and artisans by the simple usage of a general AI. So that's where I've led off. But I do want to echo at least the general message that, like, I know we titled this to AI or not AI, mainly stemming from Shakespeare's Hamlet, to be or not to be. But Adrian's right that this is not a binary. I more than anyone understand that, like, anyone who uses this, of course, is being pressured to use more resources with less money, right? Like, we're often told, hey, we have to raise more money with less. And I always want to advocate, like, if someone tells you, like, let's do more with less, just tell them, like, how about we do less with less? Let's start there. But that's where I stand with at least foundationally when it comes to AI.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carlos. We recognize that a weakness of this panel is that we were not successful in bringing someone on who works in the environmental sector. If you do and you have any insights to share, I just invite you to put those in the chat for right now and maybe chime in later when we ask people to come off of mute. But I think we've all seen some headlines recently, right, about the use of AI driving people's electricity bills up. This is a major issue in Illinois. When we think about where the placement of those data centers happens, it is usually an act of environmental racism, or at least classism. They end up in some of the poorest communities where folks can get away with more and buy larger parcels of land. There are, of course, being here in Chicago on the Great Lakes, we're really worried about our water usage. These data centers can consume a tremendous amount of water, and that is not a renewable resource, or an unlimited resource, I should say. Are there any other harmful costs of AI that you, either Adrianne or Carlos, you don't feel are highlighted enough, or that you want to make sure we kind of have on the table before we go into a more nuanced discussion?
Yeah, I'm happy to add to some of what you just shared, Kate. I was actually looking into some data, and I was actually quite surprised to see that in the US itself, I think the 5 states that are the dominant places for new data center development is Illinois, Virginia, Texas, Arizona, and California. And a lot of these are already water scarce places. And so what's happening is that the water that's being used to cool a lot of these data centers, it's treated water. So it's water that is drinking water that is taken from the municipalities. And so residents are now competing for that clean water because they can't use untreated water to cool the data centers because it would damage the sensitive computer parts. And so I thought that stat in terms of like where the data centers are currently concentrated was really interesting and alarming. And then also the other thing that I wanted to talk about, because I feel like there are studies or conversations about this, but not enough, in my opinion. But it's the harm to historically oppressed communities. And you mentioned a little bit about the environmental racism with the data centers. The other part of it is that these large language models, or the data that is used to train tools like ChatGPT, it comes from data sets, right, chosen by the people who build these technologies. So whatever data that goes into the system is the same data that comes out. So if the data is biased, the outputs will be biased as well. And so big tech is really notorious for having very homogenous workforce. It's very white and male dominated industry. And again, like having worked in tech, I can attest that that is a reality, right? That the developer teams tend to be the most homogenous and the most they're the teams that lack the gender diversity, the racial diversity, the age diversity, as well as educational diversity. And so if these are the teams that were at the forefront of building these technologies, how can we trust the outputs that are coming out of these same technologies, right? And I think, when we think about systemic oppression, the communities that get most harmed by these biased outputs are also the ones that have the least systemic power. And so a lot of people are using ChatGPT as though it is producing truthful information without critiquing or analyzing whether or not, or where the source of data comes from and who built these systems.
Yeah, I think many of us have seen headlines, right, of, I asked ChatGPT to generate an image of a scientist, and it's always a white male person in a lab coat, right? And the more you ask it to go female, it lends itself, it bends into more and more harmful stereotypes. Yeah. Carlos, anything to add to get on the table?
Besides worrying about the education of the country, anyone who uses it, what was something in my mind I was thinking about basically it feels like stolen labor. And there was a tweet that really put it into words, just like it feels like AI is for the wealthy to access skill without and without allowing skilled workers to access wealth, right?
Mm,
Like, and that's how I really feel about it.
yeah. Carlos, can you talk to us a little bit more? You have pretty deep experience in the art field, including my favorite like fun fact about you, your BA in bassoon. But can you tell us, give us kind of a report from the arts field? How is this impacting creators, artists, and what's the conversation in that sector?
Yeah, for the most part, it comes a lot more when it comes to marketing. Um, and that in that sense, and also creating any sort of printed material for invites. I'm thinking about scenic design and costume design, where a lot of some theaters utilized AI to create what they would eventually do in real life, but it gain a lot of criticism due to the fact that that is a person's job, right? Like costume designing is a person's job, or like creating a set is a person's job, or even like I'm thinking in our field of fundraising, like creating an invite, right? Like an invite, design invite or design solicitation is still like one of our jobs. And I know that it's easier for us when we are wearing many hats to just like offload this. But if someone has the capacity to actually do this, or particularly when it comes to like smaller roles like costume and scenic designing, like that's a person's job, then now we're like off-putting to a machine that may not understand everything about what's going on the stage or on the gallery. Um, and that's how it's coming across. It's just like that's where we're taking labor from them, or labor that may not be fully passable to do in real life.
Mhm. Adrian, I'll ask you the same question, but different. You have a deeper experience, I think, than many of us on this call in the for-profit sector, especially in tech. Can you give us a kind of a report from that field? What are the current topics? What are people thinking? And then how does this go into like workforce decisions, right? What if you work for a company that's encouraging or even I think this is happening in some places, mandating the adoption of certain AI tools. How are people resisting that in their circumstances?
Yeah, for sure. So, um, having worked for a number of for-profit or corporate clients, or worked with corporate clients as well as like tech clients, what I was seeing, especially with the launch of ChatGPT, was almost this mad dash to try to like adopt it as quickly as possible because it was a fear of not being able to compete with the competition. So again, it's this really, really kind of like scarcity mindset that was very prevalent in the sector. And so I've seen corporations, for example, build their own internal ChatGPT tools because of a concern also with client data and potentially having breaches around client data. And so obviously, if you translate that into the not-for-profit space, obviously not-for-profits are not going to have that budget to build their own internal chatbot, for example. But I think it's something to think about in terms of like what happens if OpenAI's data gets compromised, right? Because OpenAI runs ChatGPT. What happens to the client trust that you have? And from a not-for-profit sector, it's like how might that compromise your donor, your employee, or even the stakeholder data that you have, which then impacts your brand as well as the trust that people have within your brand. So that was something that I noticed a lot was like people talking about like how do you protect the data, even in a corporate setting. I've also seen corporations, for example, encourage their employees to turn to ChatGPT, I guess to use it more because they felt like, oh, this is going to drive productivity without identifying what are the areas that maybe it makes sense to automate, right? What are the areas that it makes sense to simplify the process? It was more so, oh, we're going through a major transformation, or we're going to be doing layoffs or a restructure. And so instead of perhaps supporting employees around like change management tools or change management support, they're like, go to ChatGPT and like look up change management tips. And so they're almost like outsourcing the wrong things, which I think is also perhaps looking at the employee experience as like a one size fits all rather than paying attention to the nuance, right? Of like, how do you actually support team morale when something like that happens? How do you make sure that your leaders are trained to support team members rather than telling them, just go to this chatbot and ask for these 10 very generic change management tips? So those are some of the things that I'm seeing, and I think it's also removing those spaces for generative conversations between team members, between leaders and their team members that can really build trust. And an example of this that I'll never forget was I was working with a tech client, and there was a team member who was trying to share feedback with me. And I think feedback was a very uncomfortable, vulnerable thing for her. So she was really struggling to tell me what it was that she wanted to share. So rather than going through the messiness of that conversation, she went to ChatGPT, copied and pasted the response, and sent it to me in a chat. And so that was really interesting because then I was trying to ask follow-up questions to try to understand like the examples and whatnot. And she would do the same thing, go back to ChatGPT, copy and paste the response. And to me, as a leadership coach, I really worry about this reliance on ChatGPT, which is, I think, weakening people's capacity for discomfort. So whether it's like the fear of saying the wrong thing or making mistakes or coming off, very vulnerable or doing something scared or not being in control, which I think is all about like what being human is about. And I think the cost of this is that we lose that opportunity to be messy together, which can sometimes be a very powerful way to connect to each other. And I think it also, causes us to lose the opportunity to, again, understand ourselves more deeply, to be like, what's actually causing this discomfort? Why am I struggling to have this conversation? What's blocking me from being able to move forward? Because all of that then feeds into our confidence in ourselves and the trust that we have what it takes to be able to overcome these blockers or this uncomfortable thing.
Yeah, I'll try to see if I can find it quickly, but there's a Substack that I subscribe to for this woman who's a female tech entrepreneur, and she's been huge into using generative AI. But she just put out a piece where she said, it's to me, it's what you just said, Adrianne. So correct me if I'm wrong, that people are incorrectly using AI, especially when they use it to skip what she calls the messy middle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is where we're actually learning and engaging with other human beings and having a conversation that can lead to new ideas, new processes. Part of the problem with these large language models is that they're not actually generative, right? They're predictive. So they're really spitting out, as you said, Adrianne, they're spitting out the data that they've been fed. But they're not really capable of original thought, right? They're just scouring the internet for what's the next word that should come after this one. I also pull out from what Adrianne said, the issue of data privacy, right? Not to make a broad generalization, but a lot of us work for smaller nonprofits and the budget for this is zero, right? So when we're turning to a large language model, we tend to be using the free or the lowest cost rung of that, right? And as they always say, if the product is free, then you are the product, right? We are being mined, or our data is being extracted to continue to propagate or to build the model. I think that to me raises a lot of alarm bells around data privacy for our donors, right? There was a survey, I shared it with you guys, but where there was a donor confidence survey, and the question was asked, does it affect your giving if you know that a nonprofit is using AI? I will say the biggest segment of that, it was like 33% or something like that, was people saying, no, it doesn't. But the next biggest section was people who said it negatively affects my relationship with that nonprofit. It negatively affects my desire to give to that nonprofit. And I think that is kind of to what Adrianne was saying, there's fundamentally a trust issue here, right? people are savvy enough to say, if you're using AI, what are you doing with my data? What parts of me are going into the large language model that are then being extracted somewhere else? Carlos, do you have any thoughts on that about nonprofit administration? How are we seeing this affect budgeting, right? Staffing levels? And do we think this will have kind of an impact on institution or individual giving?
I think so for sure. I mean, outside of the little data that you mentioned, I'm particularly worried about like the entry force, like those new to our field. Mainly because I describe fundraising as like a relationship management job, right? Like, and I am famously into saying that like fundraising is a polyamorous system, right? Like we're interacting with multiple donors or multiple funders who may are giving to hopefully to like multiple organizations. And if that's not polyamory, I don't know what is, or at least like the you know the kind of foundation of it. Um, but removing some of the humanness of it all feels like not it just doesn't sit right with me, right? And I think about it in like when I think about the entry force coming up, particularly younger folks who, as we've seen, are using AI much more than my generation and above. And thinking about like students, and the studies are saying that they're losing critical thinking, that they're losing literacy, that they're losing just remembering the question that they just answered through generative AI. They like can't even think about what was actually written, let alone the question. I worry about those coming into a field when we've tasked them to be like, hey, can you draft up a letter? Can you prepare materials? Can you organize talking points? Can you make slide decks? The things that felt foundational to my entry to fundraising, right? Like, can you organize a plan? And I think all of those things can be put into generative AI. But I worry that sometimes we understand the relationships like, oh, this person can't sit with this person because of XYZ, or like we should put this personal note because we know it and may not sit in the database, right? And those are the things that come to mind when thinking about how it affects it. And particularly because, I'm thinking Amazon, who is doing massive layoffs just so they can incorporate more of their own generative AI systems, that it's like self-serving cycle, right? Like, hey, we're gonna invest in this AI, therefore we have to like use it more, and because we have to use it more, we have to lay off people. That way we make ourselves feel better about themselves. And I think this is also part of the reason why like I think companies are enforcing folks to use AI, to be like, hey, we've invested in this and now we have to prove that it works. It's a cycle that feels vicious, particularly when there's no training for it. Because I'll say that like I don't think I'm good at using AI, right? Like someone who like will proudly say that I've never used it purposefully. But what I will not say is that I don't think it takes skill and talent to use it. I do think there's skill and talent in like using it well. Um, I just don't know what the training is for that. And the end product may not always be the thing you're wanting, and it takes some effort. And even once you get there, like all of it for me still feels that it could have been much easier had it been like one or two people talking about it in person.
It's very true. Sometimes we think we're using AI to be more efficient, and we are actually introducing inefficiencies to the system. I've seen that firsthand. I think too, Carlos, what you're talking about is as fundraisers, when we're at our best, we are relationship driven, right? And that is completely stripped away if we are one computer talking to another computer, right? I once heard somebody say the best investment you can make as a fundraiser is a box of paper clips, because everything you send out, if it's a generic letter, an annual report, you should be paper clipping a personal note to it. And to your point, Carlos, sometimes we know things or we have had interactions that we're not putting into the CRM, either because it would be silly, it would be a breach of trust, it would be, it's just the subtlety is not there, right? I, for one, have terrible handwriting, but I still write those personalized notes because I think, again, when we are at our best and when we as a nonprofit sector are really representing an alternative to the for-profit sector, we are primarily driven by people. Adrianne, that leads me into my last question, specifically for you, which was how I know that you do a lot of one-on-one coaching. And I know you have some thoughts about how AI interacts with kind of the generalized loneliness and burnout that perhaps everyone is feeling, but seems especially endemic to the nonprofit sector. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, for sure. But can I comment on what you and Carlos was also talking about in terms of like the deep relationship piece in fundraising? Because it makes me think about like how are we actually measuring success, right? So in so many organizations, we think about productivity as like the ultimate metric. And I think that we need to be very thoughtful about how we're defining success, especially in the not-for-profit sector, because it isn't about the bottom line, right? So it isn't about productivity in terms of like how quickly you can build relationships versus like how deep are your relationships with your donors, right? Because I think something about productivity is uh I do have a challenge with the term productivity because when I think about like Gen AI, actually there was this graph that I saw yesterday. They labeled it the scariest graph in the world right now. People should look it up. And it's actually a graph that shows the rise of ChatGPT when it was launched in November 2022. And it shows how job openings ended up going down by 30% after the launch, and the stock market went up by 70%. So it makes me wonder who is actually benefiting from this increased productivity, because it doesn't look like it's the working class or the employees, right, that are losing jobs. And so it makes me wonder, right, like this allure of using ChatGPT to increase productivity, well, is it actually allowing us to do more meaningful work, or is it outsourcing all of the meaningful and high value work that takes time for a reason, but we're just outsourcing it, to technology like ChatGPT. And I think like we need to be very mindful about how are we protecting the high value work that it makes sense for people to do, right? Like things that require curiosity, creativity, empathy, relationship building, our ability to hold multiple truths and contradictions. Because I think that's where you're talking about, Carlos, about like that's the essence of relationship building, right? It's um, how you help the other person feel seen and heard. And I don't think you can really box that into a nice metric that can be quantified, like using ChatGPT or Gen AI. I think those are the things that we really need to protect, especially in the fundraising and not-for-profit sector. So that's one piece I wanted to say. And then in terms of the loneliness and burnout piece, so I think that it's a really, really big issue across sectors, not just not-for-profits. So I do coach a lot of not-for-profit leaders and executives, and I think leadership in general is a very lonely space. And in addition to that, I think we are living in an increasingly lonely world as well. I do think that that's been exacerbated by COVID as well as the global lockdowns that we saw a few years back, because it really changed how we connect with each other. And I think in the not for profit, especially, there's almost this like unspoken culture that I've seen, and I've experienced it myself as well, working in not for profit earlier on in my career, of not wanting to burden your team members because the teams are already so small and resources are so scarce. And so you don't want to overburden other people with your challenges or your issues because everybody is so swamped and they don't have time. And so, a trend that I'm seeing with a lot of people that I work with, and also people around me, is that people are turning to ChatGPT for emotional regulation and support. And so, what happens is when they're feeling anxious or lonely, rather than reaching out to somebody, they're going to ChatGPT to be like, I'm feeling this way. Why am I feeling this way? How do I get out of this? And I think what's happening is that ChatGPT offers this immediate, easy, and convenient acknowledgement and validation of what they're feeling. And because it's so convenient, people are not going to maybe their community or going to mental health practitioners for the support, like the long-term support needed. And I think, we're seeing this in extreme cases where people are experiencing hallucinations with ChatGPT, where they're losing sight of reality because they're only using ChatGPT as that like sounding board rather than a real human. And in even more extreme cases and very unfortunate cases, is that there's a lot of younger people who are dying by suicide based on what ChatGPT is telling them to do through the prompts. And there's been lawsuits against OpenAI because of this. Um, it's a very scary thing that's happening. And Karen Howe, I don't know if anybody's familiar with her, but she's a journalist as well as the author of Empire of AI, which is an incredible book, a very important read. And she's done a number of stories showing how easy it is for people to start using ChatGPT as maybe like a sounding board just to generate ideas for work or like creating like fun graphics to how quickly they can slide into this space where ChatGPT becomes their sole emotional support system. And that's where it becomes really risky. And so I think when it comes to the burnout and the loneliness, like it's really prevalent, right, in not-for-profit sectors. I think it's so important for us to think about burnout not as something that you recover from, just from like a few kind of like questions to a bot, but it's actually healing work, right? It requires you to regulate your nervous system, to sit with your body so that you're no longer in that survival mode 24/7. And that requires you to be in community rather than being in isolation.
The only thing I'll add, because I love that, is there's an NPR article about students that 1 out of 5 high schoolers know someone or are themselves someone who's had a relationship with a chat GPT or generative AI function, like a romantic relation, not just like a friendship. Like there's feelings of romance there, right? And it's I'm just like, did no one see Joaquin Phoenix's Her? Did we not learn our lessons from that movie? That's the immediate thought that comes to mind.
Yeah, that is crazy to me, but maybe I'm just too old. All right, I know we're gonna wrap up. We're trying to get off of here by 10. But let's turn this to the practical now. Let's talk about what it might look like to resist AI usage in fundraising. And I want to bring up, Monica put this really thoughtful question in the chat.
Yes.
I'm just going to read it kind of into the record. So Monica said, I'm very concerned about the environmental impacts of AI as a whole, yet also have sympathy for small nonprofits who don't have the resources to have developmental staff and are otherwise extremely pressed for other resources. How would you advise them when their use of ChatGPT tremendously simplifies their workload and helps them with grant writing, etc.? Saying that use of it cuts into human jobs does not solve the problem for an organization who is not replacing a human with AI, but using it to raise funds to actually hire more staff.
Yes. I feel this is a brief call out to me because I did say that. And at least I'll clarify, right? Like not to put words in my mouth, but like I'm not saying that like it doesn't, I'm not saying it will solve a problem, right? I'm not saying that it won't keep a person in their job forever. As someone who's been laid off in the past, right? Like even if they use AI, like layoffs can still happen, regardless of how much money. Where I stand at least is that like thinking about the environment and all the other like potential and now noticeably studied impacts, like I'm not entirely convinced, and I can be persuaded. I'm not entirely convinced that like even if you were using ChatGPT or any sort of LLM to bring in 5 more donors or like 50K $1,000 more, right? Or any sort of money or any sort of profit that you get from using it, I'm not entirely convinced it's worth it, right? And that's where I stand. But I'm also not, what I'm not saying is that like you shouldn't use it because it helps. I know that it helps, right? Like I know that, particularly coming from an arts and culture place, like we are severely underfunded. Our federal money has been wiped out by this administration for decades. Arts education has been out the wazoo as something that seems for the privileged and for the elite. Um, I know that it would be so beneficial to use it, and yet it's my mainly coming from like I just don't want arts to be not centered in humanity, that I can't get myself to use it. But to kind of really answer the question, how do I advise someone to like that feels like they really need it, is that you can still use it. Just know that there's impact to it. And that for me is my main message here. Like I don't want you to stop using it if you're already using it, or if you've never used it and eventually have to use it because of the overload of work that capitalism puts on all of us. um, has to be used, right? I'm just saying that if you choose to use it, or if you're going to use it, just know that there's impact to it. And additionally, I'll say, because I'm sure these are thoughts, like I will also say that even if all of us here in this room or everyone involved with Forefront and Fight Club stop using it, it will not stop the environmental or the other critical thinking harms, right? Mainly because much like climate change, like if as individuals we do some small part, that's great, but ultimately it does not overcompensate for the harm that like big, large corporations are utilizing for this. Um, so I just want people to know that if you choose to use it, feel free. Just know that there's impacts going into it largely, and regardless of how you use it or not use it, the impact that we have as individuals will be not even a percentage of the harms that major corporations are utilizing this for.
Yeah,
I
I think
guess,
to your point.
I just want to interject because I'm sorry, I was dealing with an emergency. I am one of those small shops that only has 3 full-time staff. So I believe in some of what you all have been saying coming into this without a lot of background. But I guess as an advocate for being a progressive, which I think I need to be. I've been in higher education for 15 years, and I think to the point that Bill made, there's a lot of things that are being done to try to stop the bad things that you've all talked about and discussed. Their inventions over the course of time can all be turned to evil, can all be used inappropriately. It's up to us to try to figure out how not to have that happen. I agree, but there are cutting edge things happening at like Arizona State University, and how ChatGPT and other things are enhancing learning and doing a variety of things to simulate experiences, because there aren't enough bodies that will train and mentor people. So I guess I just want to be the advocate on this to say that there are good things happening in ChatGPT, that I would hope that maybe there were more open-mindedness about how you can utilize it. And if it's about replacing staff is your biggest concern, there are going to be other things that are going to come along to replace staff. That's going to be the continued challenge of upskilling in our industries, including fundraising. And I've seen how ChatGPT can take just looking at donor habits and being able to automate and create donor profiles easier than having weeks and months for a prospect researcher to be able to do that. So I think to your point about losing federal funding, for those shops that already have automation and using AI the right way, they're going to be able to identify a lot more donors faster. And that's just my opinion. But I do think that there's a lot more good than there is necessarily the bad. On the mental health and other issues, I think that's part of the human condition, and we've been dealing with that in our society since even before COVID. But that's just me. So maybe I'm just not thinking the same way that everybody else is.
No, and at least I'll say, because part of the reason why this conversation started is that I attended AFP-ICON, Association of Fundraising Professionals conference. There was many sessions about AI and all the goodness that it's done, or like the ethics around it, right? Like, how do you ethically use AI when you're using it? Or like, how do you incorporate AI to create donor profiles or pipeline plans? But no one was talking about the harm. And it felt so akin to my experience in the field of philanthropy, that like all what you do is share the goodness, or at least like I think of Wicked, like the perceived goodness, like Linda likes to say, but we never talk about the things that are messy in our field, the things that are like we do cause harm, right? Like I want to note, like fundraising has done good in the world, and in that process it has also harmed communities and societies, right? And we just don't acknowledge that. And for me, bringing this topic into it, it's just like I do not want to ignore the goodness that it can do, particularly for small shops, right? Particularly for folks who don't have the skill set of creating like artwork, or creating even a first draft, whose writing may not be their favorite skill. I just also want to note, and for you all to share, like when you hear other folks talk about this in our field, to give them the full breadth of like, yes, there's goodness, and in that goodness, there's also not goodness.
Mhm. I think this really speaks to some fundamental questions that in our day-to-day lives, we maybe are passing over, right? Like, how do we really measure efficiency? How do we really measure our progress? Is it just the output, 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 output? Is it just the dollars raised? Is it the relationships, right? It's something of a privilege in the nonprofit sector to have the space and time to reckon with that. And I think we're just trying to create a space to do that specifically for AI, but also for the underlying questions with it. Any other comments from folks on the call? We've talked a little bit longer as a panel than I intended, but Bill put an interesting link in the chat, some interesting work being done at UChicago. All right, I've got another question. I'm just going to read this out from Aaron. If you want to come off of mute and share, please do. Otherwise, I'll read your comment. Right.
I can, yeah, I can. I'm not in a place where I can really come get on camera, but I'm happy to read this.
Yeah.
If this works for everyone. Okay. I just want to thank you for this session. I just think it's really important and very timely, and I'd be happy to have this be continued. And I was wondering if the recording is going to be made available after the session. One of my main concerns is first of all, I write grant proposals. I'm a consultant. I work with different groups, but I'm concerned by what is being produced by ChatGPT, for example. I mean, I already see the use of jargon, whether it's by a funder, by a nonprofit organization, that seems to, I mean, I understand that language changes and we elevate, ideas are elevated, concepts, practices. But, while we're talking about inclusivity, I see more and more this language that's used that's meant to not quite obfuscate, but to set a tone of, this is what we know, this is what we believe. And if you're on board, you'll understand it, whether or not it makes sense. And so to me, the use of GPT chat just contributes to that. I mean, the tone of it, and I understand that you can put in, I want a certain style to be reflected in this. It just sounds very self-important. What else did I say here? There's kind of an authoritative tone to it often, but it doesn't say anything. It doesn't necessarily say anything. And for me, specificity, examples of your work are what promote knowledge among everybody, everybody in the field, whoever is reading that proposal, who then goes on to share that information. But when it's this kind of, generic, just terminology, and again, I'm not that technologically advanced to know exactly how they spit out this stuff. It does the opposite to me. It creates, and you're talking a lot about, loneliness and isolation. It creates this sense of nobody's really understanding what is being said, but that's not the point. The point is not to understand what's being said or to share knowledge. The point is just to get it done and to have it sound a certain way. Okay, anyway, I've talked a lot.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. I would agree with you. I have yet to see a large language model produce writing that is good. It is very good at using jargon. It is very good at using like the latest terminology. But it does often produce these like long strings of text that don't actually say anything or actually add to
Can I add to that, Aaron, to that comment? So I'm an entrepreneur. I am a one-woman shop, right? And so technically, like Gen AI can help me a lot in terms of like outsourcing a lot of the very time-consuming things, right? So writing a newsletter or generating like marketing content. The reason why I have not chosen to go down that route is because the content that I create is about connection, and I haven't been able to see content coming out of like these Gen AI tools being able to support that intention that I have, right? And I think the intention piece is so important. So again, it's not about like use it or don't use it, but it's about why are you using it, right? So if it's about, for example, you need to pump out as many grant proposals as possible within a month, right? Maybe that is the intention to like support this. But if you're trying to facilitate like deep discussions with your audience, perhaps that's not really the approach to be using to support that intention. Because I do think, yeah, there's a lot of jargon, but again, it's because it scrapes the internet, right, for like popular data, and then it just pumps it back out. And so I find that the way ChatGPT talks is not the way I talk. So, you know, like again, it's about intention behind why are you using it.
It would be great to maybe have someone do a session on prompting, because there are many things that you can train it to have your own voice. You can upload your own documents, Adriana, so that it can learn from you, but it has to be done in a safe environment. So you just have to make sure it's not the free open ChatGPT and other things to do that. But it can, I have seen it do many things. It's not necessarily perfect, but the prompting, as you get better at prompting, it can do many things to save you time and allow you to just be able to polish some things. So like all things created in this earth, they're tools for us to get things done better or faster. So I think I just encourage you, I've learned a lot in 2 years. I just encourage you to try to utilize it differently with your own materials to create the kind of outcome that you want. It can do some really amazing things.
Yeah, and I've really experimented with it as well when I was working in tech. And I think at the end of the day, everybody needs to make those choices that serve them and serve their organizations and community. And I totally agree that like for some people, it really makes sense to use ChatGPT. And I think for some, it makes sense to not use it in certain ways. And I totally respect that as well.
All right, we are coming up on 10 a.m. Carlos or Adrianne, do you or anybody else, is there just like maybe a couple words you'd like to say as kind of a closer? Then I've got just a couple slides and announcements, and we will have you on with the rest of your day.
Carlos, do you want to go?
I mean, this feels, if you know who I am or of my work, this feels so me. For me, the battle that we're all facing is the pressures of capitalism in our field. And regardless of whether you use AI or not to combat that, to make you or your organization more resourced and more funded, will be up to you, right? And for me, we're all together in trying to make our world better. And however we fight that fight is up to us.
Thank you for that. Adrianne, any closing thoughts?
Well
Words?
said. Yeah, similar to Carlos, I think it's about being informed about the cost and the benefits of Gen AI at a systemic, social, as well as individual level. And then I think the choice to use it or not to use it, or to use it in certain ways and not in other ways, that's up to you, right? I think it's about that intentionality for sure, because we are all capable of causing harm. And I think depending on our values, depending on our lived experiences, we will make different choices. And that's okay as well, because I think part of it is being able to hold those contradictions of what it means to survive in a capitalist world with the choices that we have.
Thank you. All right, I'm glad I started to try to share because it didn't share the window that I wanted to share. All right, just to wrap up, we invite you to connect with us. What is going on? Sorry, Canva's really doing me dirty. Canva, another place where they really, really, really want you to use AI, let me tell you. It started doing, I don't know if anybody's used it recently, but it has started leaving comments on my work that say, oh, we can use AI to work in this. And I'm like, we very specifically employ a creative team whose output I like and enjoy, and I want to stick with that. But anyway, please connect with us if you'd like to continue this conversation. You can find Adrianne on LinkedIn. This is just a link, or look her up, as well as her website. Carlos is on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn, and there is my email address. Carlos.
I was going to say, currently what I'm seeing is there's a pop-up window that says audience in window, so we can't read the...
Good grief. Okay. Can you see it now?
Yes, but now go back. There we go.
My apologies. Thank you very much. Canva was doing something very odd for me. All right. Please join us. Follow us on LinkedIn. You can email me directly if you'd like other contact information for our folks. I'm just Spelman@fhsr.org. This is the last meeting of Phi Club for 2025. Because we are working fundraisers, we don't meet while you're running your annual campaign. We hope you enjoy a safe and happy holidays and that your annual campaign exceeds all expectations, although I feel like none of us know what to expect this year. As I said at the beginning of this, Phi Club is an entirely volunteer organization. We work with Forefront to provide our tech and to back us up, but volunteer moderators and panelists we're all volunteers. If you are interested in this topic, if you have a topic to share for next year, I really invite you to be in touch with me. Again, I'll put my email address in the chat briefly. Please be in touch with me. Please let me know if you're interested in becoming a moderator or helping us out in any other way. Or if you just had a question or a topic that came up during this presentation and you'd like to suggest it as a topic for next year. And that is it. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you especially to Adrianne and to Carlos for leading us in this discussion. And thank you all for spending the beginning of your Tuesday with us. We appreciate you. We appreciate the work that you're doing. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.